Our first take this morning is on tackling graft in Nigeria. And of course, you would, if you have been consistent listening to us, you would know that we've talked about this a little more frequently in recent time, perhaps because, of course, issues continue to evolve. Just this morning, of course, as we showed you on the front pages of the papers this morning, it's about the Malibu oil deal that's been on since the late 90s to the current one that you just heard the AGF talk about, 22 ex-governors and many senators under probe. That's according to the Attorney General of the Federation. To take on these and other issues about the fight against corruption in Nigeria, we have with us here in the studio a senior advocate of Nigeria in the person of Mr. Paul Ananaba. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
And we also have with us in our Abuja studio, policy, political and public affairs analyst and convener, Take Back Nigeria, Jaye Gaskia. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, Mr. Gaskia.
Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with you, Mr. Ananaba. You've seen the headlines as well, and Ananaba, Dr. Ananaba, forgive me, it's just what I have here. So you've seen all the headlines, you've heard some of these things that are going on. First of all, what comes to your mind?
Well, we spent so much time talking about corruption and anti-corruption fight. Again, we'll have to look at it again, but generally speaking, I think we're beginning to, as a country, improve on seriousness with anti-corruption. That's the general thing that comes to my mind. We're beginning to be a bit more serious because we got to a point where high-ranking officers were now going to say, if you come over to this group or that group, you are now washed. I mean, in terms of you are now clean. Many of us got so worried about such comments because corruption does not know political parties, it does not know religion, it does not know tribe. When we began to look at crimes and corruption and define them by religion, tribe, and social groupings and political parties, that's when we began to lose the war against corruption.
Is that what you think is happening now?
I think that the government has become sensitive to that fact that this is what the people that are leading are beginning to believe. And I'm impressed with the statement by the Attorney General this morning, and as I read it, that yes, now we are still investigating 22 ex-governors. They couldn't come from only one political party, which means that it wouldn't have come from one part of the country. And it means that they are beginning to address the issue of sectional anti-corruption fight. And again, even senators are now also being investigated. Because the essence of these investigations, provided they are not targeted at anybody, is to ensure that people live within the codes and ethics of governance. And you could see in some countries, look at in Israel, the prime minister will be prosecuted. I mean, anti-corruption is so serious that it should know no bounds.
Okay. Let's take the opening comments of Mr. Gaskia this morning on the same matter. Well, Mr. Gaskia, first of all, what's your assessment of Nigeria's fight against, graft over the past few years, given what we found on the front pages of the papers this morning and the news that's been making the rounds? All the people in government, or as it's popularly said, politically exposed persons. What's your take on the general anti-graft fight in Nigeria?
Yeah, thank you. I think that where to start from is to try to be objective and honest. I look at the anti-corruption fight in the country since the return to democracy in 1999, and then you can say that an assessment will be a mixed assessment. There are positive sides of it, and there are also negative sides of it. The most significant thing for me, though, apart from the question of perception, of correcting the perception that every regime seems to target its own enemies and opponents, or use corruption, the anti-corruption fight as a means to silence dissent, and so on and so forth. Apart from that general issue, the other fact that I see that has been critically wrong with the fight against graft is the fact that we have failed to understand as a country that corruption is a spectrum, and that you start from opportunities that expose you and leave you vulnerable to corruption, to the actual undertaking of the corrupt practice itself. And we have concentrated a lot more on waiting for the crime to be committed, and then we start investigation, and then we do prosecution, and then some convictions. We have focused a lot more on that. And the other end of that spectrum is the fact that we actually need to do a lot more in strengthening the institutions that can help to prevent corruption from happening, particularly in the public space. So the audit function, for example, and the Office of the Auditor General of the Federation needs to be strengthened. The audit role needs to be more empowered legally. The Office of the Auditor General of the Federation, for example, is mentioned in the Constitution. The Office of the National Security Advisor is not mentioned in the Constitution. But we have a huge bureaucracy and a huge, a complex that supports the Office of the National Security Advisor. We don't have a similar thing for the Office of the Auditor General. It's an indication of how serious we actually treat corruption. If the audit processes and the audit function are treated very well and seriously, then we can nip corrupt practices in the bud. We can start trying people for intention to be corrupt, for tendency towards being corrupt, rather than wait until the after the fact and do that. So that's the situation at the moment. That's the way I see it. I see a situation where we have been focused too much on waiting for the crime to be committed, and then hoping to then catch the criminal, and that most of the time is really mediated by subjective thinking, depending on who is in office and who is in power.
Right. Now, let's come back to Lagos and take Mr. Nanaba's comments. Now, you've listened to him. He's opened another vista, saying that we probably shouldn't focus too much. We should focus, but not too much on, the convictions and what have you. Speaking of which, the EFCC from 2015 to 2019 is said to have gotten about 1,500 convictions, which is approximately one per day for that duration. But also, the AGF made a statement, which I'd like you to wade into. He said 22 ex-governors are being prosecuted. And you wonder, governors are people given the responsibility to oversee resources for people. And it brings the question, the talk about leadership, because you expect that leaders should represent the best of us. So it just hit me, the fact that we have ex-governors being prosecuted. What challenge do we have with leadership in Nigeria?
Anyway, before we get to leadership, corruption is not limited to the politicians or those in leadership. Corruption is a wide spectrum. Corruption, according to the United Nations Office on Drug and Crimes, they've been able to work out a UN Convention on Corruption. You will imagine what the spectrum of corruption is within the UN's perspective, for which they want every nation to key into. We shouldn't disregard what we see as small corruption. There's no small corruption. And I agree with my friend that we have spent all the time trying to show conviction. Conviction shouldn't be the only measure of the anti-corruption fight. And many times I've spoken about orientation, ethics, national pride, beginning to sift those who are good and those who are not good. I mean, the way it is now is so warped that you cannot easily find honest people. It's so difficult. Now, people from primary school, the foundation of corruption has been laid. You've looked at some states where you see headmasters, class teachers asking pupils to pay unauthorized fees. The children begin to say, oh, you can make money from that. But now, when you talk about governors, well, maybe we are beginning to focus so much on the bigger part of leadership to say, yes, no, there's no sacred cow. Beyond that, the governor is a human being. He's a Nigerian.
I think the reason this is of much concern, pardon me, is the fact that the volume of money we see. You hear billions of naira. So maybe this is why this is also a big deal.
That's the point.
Yeah.
We are waiting for how will you recover the monies? Many of them will be gone. It could have been prevented. That's the point I'm making.
Okay.
If we have, if you look at the global policy and procedures, checks and balances, we could prevent the humongous money. After all, what we are prosecuting is what we are able to discover. You may be surprised that many of these people would have changed the color of much of this body they are taking. And in many cases, some of these monies can be stashed overseas. You could imagine the cost of even repatriating funds today. Now, that is not to downplay the fact that at least something is being done in terms of going after the big corrupt suspects, because there are still suspects that have been investigated. Now, I will expect that we have 3 governors presently in jail, that the same energy, the same standards will be followed through, so that even when you're a governor now, you will know that if you steal, you know where you're going to. As a matter of course. If you did not steal, you'll be free. You can walk on the street.
So is this more of a system defect or an individual thing? Where do we have the challenge? With the system or with the individuals?
Both of them. We have a problem with compliance.
Which has to do with the system?
Yes. And even the individual. Because it's the individual that will comply. Now let me tell you, we have enough laws as of today to bring sanity into this country. Well, it's compliance. When it gets to compliance, you begin to, this is my brother, this is my church member, my mosque member, this is my old boy. You know all those cleavages. We don't look at compliance as compliance. That's the difference. And I give you an example. When a high-profile person is involved, you see that different standards will emerge. If a police officer a senior police officer is attacked now, I can assure you that in a matter of hours, they fish out the culprits. That's what I'm trying to say. But many Nigerians go down the drain every day, and nobody talks about it. We should begin to strengthen the institution and begin to reorientate the individual. That's the point I was making.
Okay, let's take this to Mr. Gaskia. So, well, you have also spoken about, the institutions that fight corruption. You mentioned specifically the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation. And I know that there are talks around an audit bill, being proposed in the National Assembly, which hopefully would strengthen the anti-corruption fight to prevent and to ensure that people do what they need to do per time. But then, how do you see us imbibing this culture? Because the systems have been there over the years. As Dr. Ananaba said, it is a function of compliance. How do we drive that in?
Yeah, but you see, and I like the point that you made earlier in the course of asking the question, which is the point about leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I'm not really looking at leadership just at the national level. I'm not looking at just political leadership. I'm looking at leadership as an institution. And it's a broad spectrum. So leadership includes leadership at home, leadership in school, leadership amongst your peers and the rest of us. So leadership as an institution in that way is what I'm looking at. And that's the issue, because in order for us to have strong institutions, we need, first of all, to also, in the process, ensure that leadership as an institution is strong, that we lay the basis for a strong leadership institution across the board. So let me give you an example. We were talking about how do we ensure compliance and the rest of that. Let's put a few things in place, and then ensure that sanctions are meted out to those who actually fail to comply, because that's the problem. Every time you have a punishment that is stated, but people know that they can get away without serving the punishment, then the sanction is meaningless, and so you are not going to likely have a compliance. I was initially talking about, for example, the Auditor General's office and the bill before the National Assembly. So let's imagine a situation where we have audit strengthened as an institution, and you have all our MDAs. That's the funny thing. All of our NDAs, all of our corporations have audit units and audit departments, external auditors, internal auditors, and the rest of that. But within the MDAs in particular, the audit units and the audit desks, they are still under the direct supervision of the ministries, all the other bureaucrats in the ministry, of the politicians in the ministry, the same people you are expected to be auditing. So can we have a situation where the audit role and audit functions across the board is somehow linked in terms of oversight and management to the Office of the Auditor General, so that they can be a bit autonomous and a bit independent? Can we also have the National Assembly play its role? Because what we really need to do, and that's the point Dr. Nadaba was making earlier, what we really need to do is a whole of society approach, because corruption has become very endemic. So can we have a situation where the National Assembly, in playing its own oversight function, also ensures compliance, does not cut corners, does not look the other way because something is going to be given, and the rest of that? Because if the National Assembly was doing its oversight function properly, some of these things that have become the National Assembly and the state assemblies, so I'm talking about the legislature in general, some of these things that have now become objects of suspected corruption would have been nipped in the bud if the legislative assemblies were doing their oversight of the MDAs, properly. This would have been done. Again, if we bring in the rest of the society, so there are professional associations, of lawyers, of medical doctors, of engineers, of auditors, of accountants, and the rest of them, and the labor unions, if they are also brought in and they become part and parcel not only of policy making for anti-corruption, but also of implementing and monitoring and then enforcing sanctions. Because if your member, as an auditor, for example, aids and abets corruption, the professional association should be able to actually first even discipline that person before the person is taken to court and convicted and the rest of that.
Okay. Mr. Gaskia, let me take cue from what you have said. Mr. Gaskia, just one moment. Let me bring this to Dr. Nanaba in the studio here now. Against the background of all that he has said about the different institutions, playing whatever role they need to make, clearly, the judiciary has a major role to play when it comes to fighting corruption in Nigeria. On that strength, I'd like you to weigh in on this, what's making the news now, about this Malabo oil deal and all of that. It's been on since the late 90s, and successive governments have, had one thing or the other to do with it. It's been an international, it's gone international, so to speak. How well do you think the judiciary has fared in this, given that it's a former Attorney General of the Federation that's been held now on this matter?
Number one, Adoke is still not convicted.
Agreed.
So by the Constitution, there's presumption of innocence in his favor. You will understand that Malabo is not strictly legal matter. And I'm not going to talk in details about Malabo case because it is still pending in court. But you would have seen that a lot of politics is likely to have gone into it. But that will await the prosecution. What is clear is that if the fight against corruption, I don't want to go back to how it should be fought again. If you mix what I've said with what my brother is saying from the Abuja studio, you will find out that we've touched a bit of what it is. Institutionalism alone has never been the answer to societal problems. There must be institutionalism and there must be individualism. But both of them have to work together. The problem we have in our part of the world, particularly in Nigeria, is that the individualism weighs more than the institutionalism. So the institutions many times become weak. And let's take the judiciary where you're talking about. In Nigeria, we have one of the best judiciaries in the world. But when individualism attacks any of the judicial issues, it gives a gap as if there's no judiciary. Some of the best lawyers in the world are from Nigeria. If you go to IBA conferences and other events, you can respect your country. But when it comes to a situation where judges can be removed, orders of court will be disobeyed, and nothing happens. That's why I'm talking about compliance. Then what do you want the judiciary to do? To embark on a voyage of discovery? Make orders that will not be obeyed? So we need to, as a country, come to terms to the central role of the judiciary.
Right. And
the professions should wake up. If, beyond the fact that Adoke was a minister, he was a legal practitioner. I'm just giving an example.
Absolutely.
And majority of those in governance today belong to professional associations. Those associations should wake up and begin to have serious anti-corruption, because we have to prevent these things. Anti-corruption codes.
I wonder what will happen to people that don't belong to associations.
No,
I think
coming.
That's where the individualism you talked about.
That's what I'm saying. That is institutionalism.
Right.
Individualism. In this country, when President Muhammad Buhari was president, I was already an adult then. When he was the head of state, we had war against indiscipline. Nigeria began to change their ways of doing things. So what am I trying to say? We can begin to retool, to re-educate, to retrain the minds of Nigerians as to some national ethics, some national policies that compliance is total.
Well, it's as if we're just beginning the conversation, but then look at the time. Time is already way beyond us here, but we have to thank you very, very much for opening the vista on this conversation. Dr. Paul Ananaba is a senior advocate of Nigeria. Thank you so much for your time. As well as Mr. Jaye Gaskia, policy, political and public affairs analyst and convener, Take Back Nigeria. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time.